It's a real honor to be here. Thank you for receiving me tonight, and special thanks to Enkyo Roshi and Shinryu Roshi for allowing me to speak. It feels a bit strange to be on your platform, Enkyo Roshi, but I'll do as directed. As Shinryu Roshi introduced me, I'm the Assistant Director of Soto Zen North America, which sometimes I feel is important to clarify that there's this thing called a denomination. And that's very clear when we think about religious institutions around the world, and certainly in North America, and it's true in Buddhism as well. And in Japan, there's a denomination called Soto Zen, and you will hear people say Soto Shu, and that's what that refers to, is the denomination, and it has all of the institutional qualities of an institution, it has all of the bureaucratic qualities of an institution. And a lot of that's good, and some of it is a little bit not so fun, but it's what helps keep us together. The reason I go through that all is because it creates a lot of confusion. In North America, we have many streams of Soto Zen, most of which are not underneath the umbrella of the denomination of Soto Shu. Further complication is, in Japanese, Soto Shu can simply mean the ancestral lineage of the Soto school. It can have that meaning. It can also refer to the institution of the denomination. So this creates a lot of confusion because people think, oh, the Soto Shu doesn't recognize us. Well, actually, the Soto Shu is in the business of running a denomination. And so it says, do you have the certification that's required by the denomination to serve as a priest in a temple that's recognized by the denomination? That's all very locked down, as I believe it should be. But then there's this, how do we relate, question that comes up. And so part of what my work in the Office of Soto Zen North America is first to try to take care of communities, sanghas, and individual teachers that are linked to the Soto denomination directly, but also to help cultivate a kind of a circle of a Mahasangha, which is not limited to those who belong directly to the denomination. So it's in that spirit that I'm here tonight, and I think you guys are probably one of the most mixed up. So Enkyo Roshi is a Kokusai Fukyoshi, which is a international disseminator of the Buddha Dharma, as recognized by the denomination of the Soto Shu. And I've had the great pleasure to be able to be at many meetings with your founding teacher, and we've worked together in different capacities for that. But also, I think that that's not everybody who's here. And so that's wonderful. We don't all have to belong to the same thing, but we all are descendants of the school of Dogen and of the sixth ancestor and Bodhidharma, and back to Nagarjuna and the Buddha. So how is it that we really care for each other is an important question for all of us, and it's an important question for me in the office of the assistant directorship of the denominational headquarters in North America. So if I'm really also candid about the aims or the goals of a visit like this, is to try to encourage you to keep a connection with Japanese roots. Whether you think that's good or not, that's up to you, but I'm just telling you, I want to encourage you to do that. And there's a more surface reason for that, but tonight I'd like to talk about a little bit deeper reason than that surface reason. The surface reason is 50 years is not enough time to receive the wisdom that has been cultivated in another culture for over a millennia. Just think, a millennia. That's a long time. So Japanese Buddhism, Japan first entered into Japan in the late part of 2 millennia ago. And then it has been cultivated there through that whole time. There's a very rich tradition which we've received a part of, and there's a lot to still receive. That gateway actually goes both ways. There's so many dynamic and creative things which we're doing in North America, which Japanese priests and communities are very interested in, and is inspiring and reinvigorating for a school which sometimes can go a little bit flat. You know, the weight of all that tradition has its cost. And so in my life, I've spent, since I was really 13 years old, I've spent my life in between these two cultures. And so it's my pleasure to work as a bridge in that regard. Really a bridge that is not a one-way street, but is a two-way street. So to receive the ancient wisdom, for Japan to receive the kind of creative heart of Zen that is blooming in North America, this kind of exchange is what I'm calling this more surface reason. And I'd like to talk a little bit about a deeper way to understand this, or maybe just another layer of understanding it. In the famous sastra or ancestral writing by Sekito Kisen, who is a couple generations after the sixth ancestor, at our temple, we call this the harmony of difference and sameness. And I think you call it, let me see if I can get it, the identity of relative and absolute. Is that all right? Good. So in this, Sekito Kisen, in the first lines, he says that the heart or mind of the great sage of India, this is in our translation, that this heart of the great sage of India is intimately transmitted from west to east. The heart of the great sage of India, awakening, the awakened one, the mind of Buddha is intimately transmitted. This is the foundational mythology of our tradition, that we don't just look back to a Buddha that is living in some past time, but that the Buddha's awakening is now. In fact, when the Buddha saw the morning star, he said, I, the great earth, and all beings attain to the way at the same time. That same time is really important. That's this time. It's not in the past. So in our tradition, we understand that in every generation, this awakening stays alive through a lineage. And there are lineage carriers, and there are sanghas which are served by that lineage carrier. And those sanghas also serve those lineage carriers. That's how the tradition stays alive. This is based also in a legend from the time of the Buddha, that the Dharma, after the Buddha entered final nirvana, that the Dharma would travel, the Buddha Dharma would travel from west to east. So South Asia, where the Buddha lived, that the Dharma would travel. And in fact, that's what we saw happen. Right? So the Dharma traveled, the Mahayana, into northern part of Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, the Vajrayana into Tibet, those areas, Theravadan down into Southeast Asia. In fact, there was a strong Mahayana wave first and then a Theravadan wave later. And then in the case of the Mahayana, we see from Japan in our tradition then coming to North America. So this legend, we can see, affects this translation very strongly. Is intimately transmitted from west to east. Totally like this. That's intimacy. My teacher, when I ask him about intimacy, he would say it's like this, like a gasho. You know, often there's gasho like this. That's also intimate, but this one is the very formal kind of intimacy. If you go to Eiheiji or Sojiji, the young monks there, you know, there are these young guys who kind of, they're at boot camp, right? So one of the things, the monitor will come around and check and see if your fingernails are white from pressing together really tightly. And if they're not, they'll kind of, you know, give you a little flick. And it's appropriate probably for their, the kind of training that they're doing. But for us, maybe just, you know, make sure that your gasho's completely together. So it doesn't mean that there's not a left hand or a right hand. It just means that the left hand and the right hand in this mudra are expressing that deep intimacy, which we make this mudra as we venerate, as we greet, as we express the indivisibility. Face to face, warm hand to warm hand. This is how the tradition has come to us today. But that's not actually what Sekito Kisen said. That's highly interpretive translation, which I love, but is based in this understanding about something moving, about there being a Dharma which could move from place to place, which is not exactly wrong. I don't mean to say that. But what Sekito Kisen was expressing has another layer of understanding that we can explore, and I think is really relevant for my encouragement to keep connected to the roots. So Chinese has this wonderful quality of being very ambiguous. I heard one translator from the Chinese, he translates a lot of Chinese poetry, and he said it's like the characters are hanging in empty space, and that the space is just as important as the characters themselves. So in the case of the harmony of difference and sameness, or identity of relative and absolute, each line is made up of 5 characters. And the whole thing is just 5 characters, 5 characters, 5 characters, 5 characters. But when you start turning it into English, it turns into a lot more words than that, right? So is intimately transmitted from west to east. Well, only 7. But these little things like from and to, they're really not there in the Chinese. The other thing in the Chinese is that the word order does not have such an effect on, it doesn't nail down the meaning. So in English, English syntax will tell you what the relationship between words are simply by where they are in the sentence. But if you go back to this Chinese, it's like these characters hanging in space. The way the characters relate with each other is something which can be worked with. For those of you who studied the Shobo Genzo at all, this is almost the main thing that Dogen does in that text, is instruct people how to read the Chinese. And so that's very confusing when you're reading it in English, because you'll read a passage, when you're studying this, notice this, you'll read a passage and then he'll say, and that should be understood as, and then it'll be the exact same passage. The reason for that is in the original, the first chunk is in Chinese. And the second chunk is him instructing people how to read it in Japanese. But to translate the Chinese into English, they have to make these decisions about how to translate it. Well, whose opinion do they rely on? Dogen's. So they translate the Chinese like Dogen wants you to translate it, and then they have to translate Dogen instructing people how to translate the Chinese. Anyway, more information than you need to know, probably. But it's a kind of interesting conundrum that we're in. So these characters meet, the 5 characters are east, west, intimate, mutual, connected. East, west. Notice it's not west to east. East comes first and west comes second, but that doesn't mean east to west. That just means east, west. It doesn't even mean east and west. It just means east, west. Intimate, mutual. This is a beautiful word, right? In the Chinese, it's a character for tree and the character for eye. Just actually, when you look at anything, is total intimacy. It's the eye and the tree. Where's the tree? Where's the eye? We don't need to know. We can't know. That's mutuality and connected. So here we could say that this is a kind of expression of one body of awakening. The East and the West are indivisible. They are intimate. It's not just that something passes intimately. You know, I always wonder why we're supposed to carry these when we teach, but tonight I know. West? Is that right? East? All right. West, east. So in our mind, we think there's a west and there's an east. But if you take something like a stick, the west end of the stick and the east end of the stick, completely indivisible. If you say, I just want the west part of the stick, and say you cut it off, and you say, I'm just going to keep that one, well, guess what? The part you leave has a west and an east, right? Anyway, there will always be a west and an east. The west and east is the description of one body. It's the description of something that can't be pulled apart. That the Dharma is alive as all beings. This is what the transmission is about. In a way, really nothing travels at all. So last year when I was first traveling a little bit to visit centers, I have this quality of wanting to stir things up a little bit. And I was trying to think about how could I stir things up a little bit. I didn't even know what I want to stir up. I just know I want to stir it up because it's sort of my character. And I was thinking, but I don't want to just show up someplace and be a jerk, right? So it's like, that's not the point of stirring things up either, but I just want to kind of spritz it a little bit. And I was thinking, what could that be? And I thought, the Lotus Sutra. Americans are allergic to the Lotus Sutra. So I thought I'd read from the Lotus Sutra. But then as I started traveling around, I found out that people seem to get rid of their allergy to the Lotus Sutra. Are you allergic to the Lotus Sutra? Anybody here? Well, one of the reasons, joking about that, but it's very, very religious text. In the imagery is very religious imagery. And I think for a lot of reasons, the causes and conditions that people came to Zen Buddhism in North America, a lot of people were burned by their faith that they were born into, and they come to Zen because they need to get away from that a little bit. And so I understand that, and I respect that, but also think maybe it's time for us to get over that. So in that spirit, I want to read this image from the Lotus Sutra, which is probably the most famous image from the Lotus Sutra. If you're somebody who loves images, that's pretty nice, isn't it? It's a little ogre. This is, I would encourage you to go to the Venerable Google and do an image search for this image. Probably you can also will come in your mind as I read it, but there's a lot of beautiful art in East Asia of this image. So this is in the introduction. Sitting cross-legged, the Buddha entered the state of concentration called the place of innumerable meanings, in which his body and mind were completely motionless. Then Mandarava, great Mandarava, Manjushaka, and great Manjushaka flowers rained down from the sky on the Buddha and the entire assembly, while the whole Buddha world trembled and shook in 6 ways. Then the whole congregation, monks and nuns, laymen and laywomen, gods, dragons, satyrs, centaurs, asuras, griffins, chimeras, pythons, humans and non-humans, as well as minor kings and the wheel-turning saintly kings, astonished because this had never happened before, with palms together and with complete attention, joyously looked up at the Buddha. From the tuft of white hair between his eyebrows, one of his characteristic features, the Buddha emitted a beam of light, illuminating 18,000 worlds in the east, so that there was nowhere that it did not reach, down to the lowest purgatory and up to the highest heaven. In those worlds, all the living beings in the 6 states could be seen. Likewise, the Buddhas existing at present in those lands could be seen, and the sutra teachings those Buddhas were preaching could be heard. Monks and nuns, laymen and laywomen who had attained the way through practice could also be seen. Further, one could see bodhisattvas, the great ones, walking the bodhisattva way due to various causes and conditions, with various degrees of faith and understanding and in various forms. Likewise, Buddhas who had entered complete nirvana could be seen, and one could see their stupas made of the 7 precious materials, stupas that had been built to hold the remains of these Buddhas after they had entered complete nirvana. So the Buddha sits in the West. And as his samadhi is complete, a light illuminates all the worlds of the East, which actually means all worlds. From the highest heavens to the lowest hells, all beings can be seen. And particularly the beings that are walking the path of the Bodhisattva and have attained the way in various causes and conditions. Their teachings can be heard. It's a beautiful image. And it's about this relationship between the West and the East. Now, Dogen says something very interesting about this image. He says it's not as if a bolt of white silk was unfurled from the Buddha's brow and laid over the eastern quarters. It's a very curious image. It's very beautiful. If you think about Dogen's time, there was probably no lights that were directional. You know, if it was today, he might say it's not as if there was a headlamp on the Buddha's head, shining a light to the east. So he uses this very poetic idea of silk being unfurled and laid out. It's not as if there is a light in the west that then shines on the east. Then he says this very tricky thing. Again, it's in Chinese. There's a kind of rough translation. The illumination of the eastern worlds is the eastern world's illumination. The illumination, verb, of the eastern worlds is the eastern world's illumination, noun, or the eastern world's luminosity. It's not as if the Buddha shines the light on the east. It's that the Buddha's seeing is the recognition of the luminosity of all beings. It's not that there's a light in Japan or in China or in India that we're trying to slurp up the dregs of here in North America. There is the luminosity of our being, which allows for our sanghas to be vibrant, for our lineages to stay responsive and heartfelt. That doesn't come from somewhere. That is the one body of awakening that the Buddha expressed those 2,500 years ago under the Bodhi tree. But it is our responsibility to care for the wholeness of that body. And that's this part of the transmission that I want to point you to tonight. That there is an open and easy way in which intimacy is the fact of how we're living. And I believe that's the appropriate basis for a continued deep relationship between a denomination, which has all of the complications of a denomination, and a lineage, which can't be contained by circumscribing it with an institution. And we have something to teach the Japanese institution in that regard. We also have something to learn from them with regard to saying, if we want to really care for that lineage, we have to invest in each other. Not just invest in my idea about what the maintenance of the lineage is, but invest in each other, which means doing things like saying, let's care about how each other do things. Let's do some things together. Let's try to work for a mutual recognition of the work that we're doing and a cooperation. So that's my stump speech for staying connected and also turning your mind to the roots. Not because you don't already have it, but because already having it means that kind of mutuality. I think we may have a little time if anyone had any questions or rebuttals or clarifications. I'm open to any of the above. And also anything if you're curious about me, or it doesn't have to be Dharma stuff, it could be just like, where's the headquarters located?
I'm curious about your time in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
You alluded to age 13?
So I went for the first time to Japan when I was 13, and I went with a friend's family. I was practicing judo, and I got really enthralled with all kind of Japanese things. And it was a time when they've just remade it, the miniseries called Shogun, which was a popular novel. They've just remade it. I heard it's really good. And they actually focus on the Japanese characters this time, I heard, which is mind-blowing. And so I was really into all kind of samurai and ninja and all manner of those things I could get my hands on, in the public library, and really infatuated with Japan. I became good friends with a boy, we were same age, who moved in across the street from me, and his father taught Japanese at Willamette University. I grew up in a town called Salem, and there's a small university there. And they said, hey, we're going in the summer, you want to come with us? And so it was really great good fortune that I was able to go at that time. It was about that same age in which I first was taught a very simple kind of meditation from a teacher who had an after-school program for Chinese brush painting, like Salem, Oregon, Chinese brush painting. It's like, I didn't keep doing the Chinese brush painting, but it was like she just opened this door into a chamber that I didn't know existed. And really, in a way, was my first teacher. I don't remember her name, but she would just give us this very simple thing to do. We're middle school, mostly boys, so you need to do something before trying to get us to do some brush painting. So that's the first time I went, and what I found was the most amazing were the temples, and they really stuck with me. And so I wanted to go back to Japan. I went back in high school as an exchange student and was there for a year in the middle of Tokyo. And I would go to the temples often just to find some quiet. I was not from a big town, and here I'm in this megalopolis of Tokyo. And then I returned to my high school in Oregon, and the woman who became my wife was an exchange student to my high school. So yeah, we're 33 years. We met in high school, and then we started dating, and then I went back in college, so I didn't originally go to Japan for Zen, at least explicitly, and then we started a family very young, and we lived back and forth between the two places, and I met my teacher along the way, and was ordained. And so most of my practice was at a family temple, not a monastery. I already had 2 children when I was ordained, or actually one in the oven. And so my teacher he had 4 children, and by that time it was his oldest son who was taking over the temple and his kids. So he was living with his grandkids and his son's family at the temple. So that was most of my practice. And then we moved back to Oregon in 1998, and I had the ridiculously kind of, not seeing any barriers type attitude that you can only have when you're in your late 20s and early 30s. I was like, well, I'm just going to start a temple. And didn't know anything about zoning laws or those kinds of things, building codes, but I learned a lot. And we established the temple there. It was officially opened in 2004. And so we'll celebrate our 20th anniversary this year. And all during that time, I've been going back and forth a lot and serving in some capacity in the SOCON's office as well.
And you speak Chinese?
So when I studied, I was, my teacher doesn't speak English, and we would read texts together, and almost always they would be in Chinese. So I don't speak Chinese at all, but I can read Chinese Buddhist texts. It takes me a long time, compared to a Chinese reader. I need to look things up now and again, but I really enjoy that. Actually, Chinese is more similar to English in many ways than it is to Japanese, in terms of at least how the syntax works. So when Japanese people read Chinese, they do these kind of backflips to be able to do it. It's interesting. But they read the characters, so they have that that big bonus. So I really enjoy looking back. And my teacher was like, he grew up in Taiwan, and he was always looking back to China. And he would travel to China and he studied Chinese. And I think that's really something that has always happened in every transmission of the Dharma, or this discovery of this indivisible body, is that some people study about the place that it came from. I don't think everyone needs to do that. I think more people need to do it than are. Like, virtually no North American clergy speak Japanese. Again, no comment on any individual person, but as a collective, we could do a little better there. And so we're used to everything coming into English. In fact, Shohaku Okumura Roshi, who's a big translator of Dogen's work into English, he said something that really resonated with me. He said, the United States is a lot like China was. We're used to everything coming into our language. So in fact, the Chinese, they translate into Chinese and they just got rid of the Sanskrit. They just burned it or threw it away. What's in Chinese now? We don't need it anymore. And he said there's this real deep resonance between the China at that time and the United States at this time, that we have that same kind of attitude. And he was sort of letting us off the hook, but not really. He was saying, not such a great approach. But it's good. We have these hard drives now that can keep everything, more stuff than we need to, so we don't have to burn the Chinese.
Hey, Joe, what would you say is the biggest challenge for you in negotiating these two worlds, or two streams?
It always changes. And so I would say early on, I spent a lot of time culturally interpreting. So in the meetings we would have, or if I was trying to do some work with Sanghas here in relationship with the Soto Shu, it was all about like language translation, but cultural translation. So as an example, Japanese culture really values that you will make a show of doing what it is that is required. But that can be very performative, and it's not considered two-faced at all. It's actually to fill out the paperwork correctly, whether you did what the paperwork says or not, is not the point. And that's Japanese culture. That's not underhandedness. It's like a deference to the system, to be willing to say, we did the Dharma combat ceremony on this day, even though it was done on a different day. But you know that you should write it on that day because that shows deference to the system. They don't actually care when you do it. They care that you show that you know when you were supposed to have done it. And so that for Americans is just, people were like, it feels dishonest, you know? And I would say, no, actually, by insisting that you be honest, you're being obtuse. And it's not required for it to be honest in the way you think the way that it should be. So it was a lot of that kind of thing. And then the other direction where Americans would say, you know, like from American Sangha, they would be making a strong case for something. And then I'd be translating to the Japanese and saying, because they would be like, oh, we have to change everything. I say, like, just wait a day and everyone's opinion will change. So the fact that people are saying something really strongly, their total conviction in this moment does not indicate a totally thought out stance on the situation. It is just their immediate passion, which you should appreciate, but not, it's not that you shouldn't take it seriously, it's just that you shouldn't take any action based on it until it matures into something else. Because in Japan, you would never express that until you'd gone through that process of maturation, and then you would express it. So that would be an example the other direction. So I did a lot of that, and I got very tired, always being in the middle. And then I realized a little bit like, well, wait a minute, the more I do this in a way, the more that people stop learning from each other, and I got to get out of the way a little bit, and then just say, hey, by the way, you know, rather than being kind of in the middle of things. So that was there for, you know, for a good chunk of time as a big challenge. And then from there, it went more to being able to see the real strength of what is happening in North American Sanghas, the beauty and strength of it, and the beauty and strength of the tradition, the way that I was trained in Japan. And for a period, there was pretty strong animosity that would flare up at times. And that was really hard to be in the middle of, to really have a care and love for both, and to feel like people couldn't really see each other. I think that started to shift quite a bit. And I'm really happy for that. And I just became the assistant director last year. And it's really interesting the way that hierarchy has problems, but also has some real beauty. And for those of you who had the experience before of a promotion, one of the things that I appreciate about that is that actually you just have to drop a whole bunch of things. Like opinions I had last year, as soon as I became the assistant director, they just disappeared. Like, because I realized my job is different than it was before. Before, it may be important for me to have an opinion in a certain direction. And now, I feel like the challenge is to not. My job is not to have an opinion. My job is to listen, and then to find out what is the direction of movement that is responsive to the moment that we're in with the institutions and people that we're working with. And so the thing I like about that progression is this one feels much more dynamic. Before, I was doing a kind of like heavy lifting, which was appropriate for the time and place. And now feels much more liberating. And I'm also getting older, so maybe I just relax a little bit because I don't have as much energy to do stupid things. I still do plenty of stupid things, but yeah.
What is the book that you brought with you?
This is the Lotus Sutra. And this translation is by a man named Gene Reeves, who was a very deep devotee of the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra is I would say, the soulscape of the Japanese people. That this sutra entered into the culture and became the foundational sutra of state Buddhism in Japan. And it really is the fundamental quality of the Japanese Buddhist heart. Dogen, for example, quotes the Lotus Sutra more than he quotes from any text, and not just by a little bit, by a factor of 10 or something. And not only quotes from it, but the imagery that he uses when he describes things is very, very often Lotus Sutra imagery. So I really recommend this translation, although there are many translations. And Gene Reeves, one of his real genius qualities, he passed away. I really wanted to meet him, but I wasn't able to, is that he calls out the essential quality of imagination as being foundational to religious life. And oftentimes people are allergic to the Lotus Sutra because they think it's about belief, because our Western Protestant tradition particularly has tried to circumscribe religion by saying that it is the measure of adherence to a particular dogma. And he was very clear to say, no, it's not about dogma, but it's about the imaginative capacity to see a world in a different way than the way that we typically reduce it to. And that's a quality of the Lotus Sutra, which I think really is important. And he talks about that in the introduction in this particular one. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, I really recommend this, his writing. He's also written a couple other books, one called Stories of the Lotus Sutra, and I also really recommend